Good afternoon. My name is Margaret Nowicki from the Department of Public Information. This morning, the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues opened its 15th session. More than 1,000 Indigenous participants from all regions of the world are expected to attend the two-week session, which this year is devoted to Indigenous peoples and conflict, peace, and resolution. Conflicts affecting Indigenous peoples seem to be on the rise. Often they are specifically related to Indigenous peoples' lands, territories, and resources, or their rights and distinct identities. The forum will look at the root causes of these conflicts, but also the role of Indigenous peoples in peace processes, their access to justice, and their contributions to a sustainable peace. To brief us on the opening and the main topic of the session, we have three distinguished speakers here with us today. Mr. Alvaro Esteban Pop-Ac, the chair of the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues. He is a Maya Quechua from Guatemala. He is the founder and president of NALEB, an organization focused on promoting multicultural societies and political participation of Indigenous peoples. He also headed the Indigenous Electoral Observation Mission in Guatemala, among many other distinguished activities at the local, national, and international level. We also have with us the Honorable Carolyn Bennett, Canada's Minister of Indigenous and Northern Affairs. She is also a member of Parliament. From 2003 to 2006, she was Canada's first Minister of State for Public Health. Prior to that, Dr. Bennett was a family physician and assistant professor in the Department of Family and Community Medicine at the University of Toronto. And then thirdly, we have with us Mr. Raja Devasish Roy, who is a traditional circle chief known as the Chakma Raja or Chakma Chief in the Chittagong Hill Tracts region of Bangladesh. He has been practicing law in the Dhaka District Court and in the Supreme Court of Bangladesh, and is a member of many international, national, and local organizations dealing with Indigenous peoples' rights, human rights, development, and the environment. I would also like to acknowledge the presence in this room of the Honorable Jody Wilson-Raybould, Minister of Justice and Attorney General of Canada. Welcome. We will hear from each of our speakers, and then they will take your questions. So I would like to begin by calling on Mr. Pop. Sir, you have the floor.
Muchas gracias. Para el Foro Permanente sobre Cuestiones Indígenas de Naciones Unidas es una sesión, la 15ª sesión, sumamente importante porque vamos a escuchar y pretendemos tomar nota de la realidad, la postura y el planteamiento que los pueblos indígenas tienen con respecto al cumplimiento de sus derechos, pero particularmente en el tema de la paz, el conflicto y las resoluciones. El foro permanente, integrado por 16 expertos, va a tener la oportunidad de tomar nota alrededor de estos temas y vamos a construir una serie de recomendaciones que nos van a permitir avanzar en ese diálogo entre estados y pueblos indígenas para mejorar las condiciones del cumplimiento de los derechos de los pueblos indígenas. Mi nombre es Alvaro Pop, soy de Guatemala, del pueblo indígena maya. Mi idioma es el quechí y reconozco que en América Latina tenemos el reto enorme de buscar la paz en muchas de las regiones, pero también de cumplir compromisos, cumplir pactos y convenios como en otras regiones del mundo. Muchas gracias por acompañarnos.
Thank you very much. Ms. Bennett.
Thank you very much, and I too am grateful to be here on the traditional territory of the Lenape people and to have received the welcome from the elder of the Onondaga Nation. I'm very pleased to be here with the inspiring Jody Wilson-Raybould, the Minister of Justice and the Attorney General of Canada, who spoke so eloquently this morning about the challenges facing us in Canada. As we represent the Government of Canada and as we welcome the dialogue that will be here over the next 2 weeks. We've heard loudly that it was long overdue that a minister lead the delegation to this important forum. And as you know, our Prime Minister has rightly said that there's no relationship more important to him and to Canada than the one with Indigenous people. C'est l'opinion de notre gouvernement que notre relation avec les peuples autochtones doit baser sur une reconnaissance de droit, le respect, la coopération et le partenariat. As the Minister of Justice said this morning, that this relationship based on recognition of rights, respect, cooperation and partnership is actually in the mandate letter of every minister in our government. And we are now developing the plan to make sure that that is actualized in every ministry, as well as we have to make sure that this happens in all our provinces and territories, municipalities, the private sector, as well as the community-based organizations. So our Prime Minister has tasked all of us with reconciliation, and we know that furthering reconciliation is vital for all Canadians. I believe that as my friend and colleague, the Minister of Justice, Jody Wilson-Raybould, said this morning, that it is through our Constitution, Canada already has the legal tools to support Indigenous communities, to move beyond our colonial legacies and support self-government and self-determination. We must, together with Inuit, First Nations and Métis, breathe life into what was so hard fought for in Section 35 of our Constitution. It's through this framework that the Constitution will really be able to see the principles of the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples come to life, as it already is in many Indigenous communities from coast to coast to coast. The conversation about the UN Declaration is important because we've learned from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission that the legacy of colonization has been far-reaching. It means in the outcomes on health, education, economic outcomes, that we have a lot of work to do yet in Canada. Also that so many Canadians were totally ignorant about this sordid chapter in our history. Canada has much to share with the United Nations as we move and try to shake our colonial past. And Canada has much to offer on what we have learned and what we are recognizing now. But what I can tell you, we never learned in school. We also have much to learn from other nations who are also working in their own ways to undo the wrath of colonization in their own countries, and that some of them in conflict in other bays, as the President has said. So it is that we want to demonstrate today and in these coming weeks our commitments to ensure that all Canadians have a truly concrete roadmap to reconcile with Indigenous people. And that's why I'm pleased to confirm that tomorrow it is Canada's intention to remove our permanent objector status and become a full supporter of the United Nations Declaration for the Rights of Indigenous Peoples.
Thank you very much, Ms. Bennett. I'd now like to call on Mr. Roy.
Thank you. Good afternoon, all. Let me take you to the Eastern Hemisphere, to Asia. I come from Chittagong Hill Tracts, Bangladesh, where there are a lot of conflicts, a little bit of peace. We have some peace accords, most of them unimplemented. Some resolution. I wish we could say reconciliation like in Canada. We had some very good stories from the Minister this morning. So in Asia, there is from Philippines, Indonesia, Myanmar or Burma, Bangladesh, Northeast India, lots of conflicts happening. Some peace agreements have been signed, including in my region, where I played a role as a mediator. I'm one of the traditional chiefs. But we are yet to see implementation of the substantive bits of the agreement on demilitarization, devolution, land conflict resolution, self-governance. But if you go across the border from Bangladesh, you go to Northeast India, you will see some peace agreements and some ceasefire, but really peace in the sense of justice, peace in the sense of development with our own identity, and true democracy, which is not just people voting one person, one vote, democracy with pluralistic systems of representation from traditional to elective to bureaucratic, is not happening. And in Asia, we do not have. That's the only region without a human rights mechanism. All other regions in the world have it. Now we have human rights institutions, national human rights institutions. Some of them are becoming stronger, but they are not strong enough. And here at the forum, we are very keen to engage with them in the next few days. And hopefully we will be discussing whether the human rights institutions will have some sort of a status to come and report to the forum. And also we look forward to also the other body, the expert mechanism on the rights of indigenous peoples. We are talking about expanding its mandate, reviewing its mandate. Where do we go to? Where we talk about peace accords. We in the Hill Tracts had both a historical treaty with Lord Cornwallis, who went to Canada, and we had a modern-day treaty in 1997. So many of these things are under discussion at the forum. We hope both the forum and the expert mechanism will open up new avenues. And now, as we're dealing with the Sustainable Development Goals, the UN System-Wide Action Plan, and the national action plans that governments will take for indigenous peoples, these are all very, very valid for peace, conflict, and development. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We'll take your questions now. Please introduce yourselves to our guests. Yes, ma'am.
Hello, hello. Hi. Melissa Kent, Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, CBC, and member of the United Nations Correspondents Association. And on behalf of UNCA, I'd like to thank all of you for holding today's press conference. My question, not surprisingly, is for Minister Bennett. And I'm wondering if, based on what you have just announced, Canada's shift in its position towards the declaration, if you could just sort of give us an overview of Canada's position vis-a-vis this document since it was implemented in 2007, how it's changed, evolved over the years, and what today's announcement means.
I think today's announcement means that we will fully adopt and work to implement. But I think it also means that with the results of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and the 94 calls to action, that we will be implementing in the spirit of full reconciliation with Indigenous people in Canada. And so it is, as the Minister of Justice said earlier today, that this is these rights were intended to be in Section 35. And this is about breathing life into Section 35 with a roadmap, with actual principles that lets us know along the way as to whether we're getting this right.
Can I just get a quick follow-up?
Yes.
Sorry. Could you tell us, explain what Canada's shift in position will mean concretely on the ground within Canada? What will change domestically and specifically, in the broader sense, and specifically the clause on obtaining free and prior consent from Indigenous groups when it comes to land and resources within Canada?
Well, again, I think that it means a great deal in Canada, but it means a great deal, I think, around the world. That Canada is no longer a persistent objector, that we are fully adopting this and working to implement it within the laws of Canada, which is our charter. And so this is a matter of us really helping Canadians, provinces and territories, cities, private sector, everyone understand what it means to be seeking consent by meaningfully engaging with Indigenous people, and for us to also be aspiring to a day when self-government agreements and moving out from under the Indian Act is the way that Indigenous people in Canada live.
I would have a follow-up, but I'll let some of my colleagues.
Okay, I'll come back to you. Matthew, please.
Thanks a lot. Matthew Lee, Intercity Press, on behalf of the Free UN Coalition for Access. Thanks a lot for the briefing. I actually do want to ask on Canada. I wanted to ask: is there's this particular example of in Ontario, the community with high youth suicide? I believe that one member of your delegation didn't come in order to address it. It's been raised to the Prime Minister. Just as an example, what do you think that this shift in policy will actually mean for that community in terms of resources and in terms of addressing the issues that they've raised. And I wanted to ask also about Bangladesh, if you don't mind. We've spoken before, and I wanted to know what the status is in terms of the military. I know that there have been, Bangladesh is a big peacekeeping contributor to the UN, and there's some issues that have arisen about how they perform actually in the country. Has there been any development on trying to get the UN to use what I guess the leverage that it has as UN peacekeeping to try to deal with the issues that you face in your region? Thanks.
Thank you for the question, and particularly how linked youth suicide and attempted suicide is to a lack of pride in being Indigenous. It is about needing a secure personal cultural identity of that is your self-esteem, that is your resilience, that's your sense of control over your own life. And it's only when young people can see themselves with role models and hope that we actually will deal with this issue of youth suicide. When I met with the Youth Council in Attawapiskat, that's what they were talking about. They wanted language and culture back. They wanted programs on the land. They wanted to be able to be in touch with the heritage of their people and to be competent, culturally competent and competent on the land. And it is I think it's very linked that our embracing, adopting, implementing of the UN Declaration actually speaks to the fact that Canada is with them on this journey, and that we don't want to let them down.
Mr. Wright?
Thank you. Actually, as we speak, the Honourable Prime Minister of Bangladesh inaugurated a Chittagong Hill Track Centre at the capital yesterday, and where she did speak about the military presence and said that a large garrison was being built outside the Chittagong Hill Tracks to actually take in many of the military who are now stationed in the hill tracks. And I think she mentioned 4 brigades. But whatever the numbers are, they are really too many. And the nature of their presence, it's beyond what the military should be doing in peacetime. And we would like to think that you are better peacekeepers by not being involved in things you're not supposed to. Like law and order functioning is a policing matter and not a military matter. And so with the DPKA and all, I don't know of any high-level dialogues, but we believe that there should be more transparency, that troops be scrutinized, and they should be encouraged to become better peacekeepers for the UN, and also so that they also respect human rights back home.
Thank you. Yes, ma'am.
Linda Rollins with IPS. Thank you very much for this briefing. I wanted to ask about, since your theme is peace and conflict, I wanted to ask about environmental defenders, since often Indigenous people are the subject of violence because of their role in protecting environmental resources. So I think this is something that we're seeing all around the world, but there has been some attention on it recently with the recent murder of Berta Cáceres. I'm just wondering where you see the UN's role in this, and also I think it's been raised that the climate change agreement could be one way that the role of Indigenous people could be recognised for what they do in terms of protecting natural resources. Are there any other ways that that role could be recognised by the United Nations? Thank you.
Thank you. Who would like to? Would you like to speak? Yes, thank you.
Hay una contradicción entre lo que los pueblos indígenas han preservado con respecto a la naturaleza, el medio ambiente, y lo que los estados en muchas regiones del mundo los han tratado y han manejado las reivindicaciones que alrededor de los recursos naturales los dirigentes indígenas han desarrollado. Nos preocupa, y me preocupa en lo particular, que en casi todas las regiones del mundo tenemos denuncias de persecución a líderes que son activistas y que han protegido fuertemente los recursos naturales y han cuestionado las acciones que muchas veces se han hecho, o en la mayoría de casos se ha hecho sin consulta. Me parece que Naciones Unidas tiene la gran oportunidad, a través del Foro Permanente y el Consejo Económico y Social, de recibir las recomendaciones que hace el Foro precisamente en la búsqueda de mejores procesos de diálogo y el reconocimiento, como usted muy bien plantea, de que los dirigentes de los pueblos indígenas son protectores y son defensores de un ambiente que el mundo necesita. La discusión al respecto es una buena posibilidad en torno al cumplimiento también de los derechos de los pueblos indígenas, y en ese sentido quiero felicitar al pueblo y gobierno del Canadá por esa decisión tan importante alrededor de la declaración. Creo que efectivamente las preguntas que se han mencionado acá son las preguntas que en todos los lugares tenemos que hacer, es decir, cómo llevamos a la práctica los reconocimientos de la declaración, la aprobación y ratificación del convenio 169 que trae de manera clara la consulta previa, libre e informada, cómo lo operamos y sobre todo los siguientes pasos en todos los países que han reconocido la declaración y el convenio es qué reformas legales, qué normativa constitucional habrá que transformar para beneficio del cumplimiento de los derechos de los pueblos indígenas. Es una enorme preocupación del foro la violación a los derechos de los pueblos indígenas en ese contexto de búsqueda del respeto de la declaración en el ámbito de las explotaciones mineras, las explotaciones hidroeléctricas. Hay mucha denuncia alrededor de eso. Y eso genera pocas posibilidades de paz y ha levantado mucho el conflicto. Por eso es nuestra preocupación y vamos a escuchar ahora a los pueblos indígenas y a intentar hacer una hoja de recomendaciones que permita tomar en cuenta estos temas.
Thank you. Any other comments?
I think that your point around environmental protection is really important, and I think that although Canada fought very hard to get Indigenous knowledge into the bulk of the agreement, it was placed in the preamble. And I think what we know in Canada, if we listen to Indigenous people, we will make better decisions. That whether it's the Inuit on climate change or any of the people, that if you trust Indigenous knowledge and listen to the elders and understand that the sustainability principle of thinking 7 generations out is actually the Indigenous way that we will protect our planet in the air and the water and the land. And so I think it is about meaningful engagement that in terms of resource development, that often we will have, you can develop there, but you're not to develop there. It is about seeking a win-win that only starts with a very, very early conversation. And I think that it is the way to avoid conflict is to be able to start very early on with the conversation. And for people to not, it isn't just consultation tick, it's meaningful engagement where people actually know they've been heard. And so it's my friend from Bangladesh, I was thinking when you were speaking about peace, that I think one of my big heroes and peace activists in Canada, Ursula Franklin, always says that peace isn't just the absence of war, it's the presence of justice and human rights. And so it's a matter, and I did want to say too that Cornwallis came to us after you, and the city of Halifax is now fighting to get rid of the statue, in that his anti-Indigenous views are now no longer quite comfortable in that beautiful city of ours. So.
Thank you. Thank you.
Did you?
Yes, sir. Oh, excuse me. Mr. Roy would like to make an intervention.
I'll try to be quick. Let me mention an opportunity, and I think the opportunity is the outcome document of the World Conference, where it mentions Mother Earth, climate change, biodiversity, and Indigenous people's role in it. So this is one way of bringing Indigenous people's role in climate change into the development agenda. But unfortunately, enough has not happened in the climate change process itself. I happen to attend a few, and sometimes I wore a government hat, I could go and speak. If you wear the Indigenous hat, you're out there and trying to get the attention of the parties. So since Cancun Declaration in Mexico, not much has happened. But if what has happened in the World Conference outcome document, some of the things could be put on board into the climate change agenda at the Conference of the Parties, and also with the system-wide action plan of the UN, and at the national levels, the national action plans of governments. And the other thing I'll just quickly mention is that where with development and trade, sometimes companies are going in and really violating the human rights of indigenous peoples and environment. And so if governments and shareholders, companies could take account of what their shareholders are doing, we were discussing in Guatemala, Canadian companies there, British companies, American companies, etc., to take hold of them and say what environmental rights and human rights they are violating.
Thank you. Yes, sir.
Thank you, Mauricio Guerrero, Mexican News Wire Agency. So I'm going to ask my question in Spanish to Mr. Alvaro Pop. Hemos visto un repunte de la violencia contra los defensores del medio ambiente y derechos humanos indígenas, como mencionó la compañera. ¿Cuáles son las condiciones que han permitido ese repunte específicamente en América Latina y en América Central y en México? ¿Y cuál es el papel de la industria minera en ese repunte de la violencia? Muchas gracias.
Encontrar una generalización que nos permita responder a esa pregunta es complicado. Sin embargo, tenemos que reconocer, como el caso de la señora Berta Cáceres en Honduras, que en muchos casos hemos tenido una persecución a los líderes que protegen los recursos naturales a partir de intencionalidades o decisiones de inversión que tienen las empresas. Y en muchos casos también tenemos que reconocer la denuncia de organizaciones de pueblos indígenas, de organizaciones sociales, en donde hay regiones del mundo en donde existe una alianza entre estas empresas y los gobiernos. ¿Por qué el repunte? Me parece que esto es una respuesta global, y es que cada vez más el mundo y el sistema global necesita de los recursos que tienen los pueblos indígenas, que han protegido por cientos de años los pueblos indígenas. Y el no cumplimiento de una consulta previa, libre e informada trae consigo este tipo de roces y este tipo de enfrentamientos. Y en consecuencia, una de las recomendaciones que el foro ha insistido es, en primer lugar, el cumplimiento de la consulta previa. La consulta tiene que ser previa. Tenemos ejemplos en el mundo que la consulta se hace luego de haber dado derechos de explotación, incluso derechos de exploración. Y eso es un absurdo. Si esto continúa así, las posibilidades de crisis y de enfrentamiento aumentan. Por otro lado, también necesitamos que el diálogo sea realmente de buena fe. Es decir, que vaya con el propósito de hacer un compromiso real y vinculante con lo que se pacte. Y finalmente, me parece que el Foro Permanente y Naciones Unidas tiene la posibilidad de acompañar estos procesos y de vigilar que efectivamente desde el ámbito internacional se puedan cumplir. Algo que ya se ha venido haciendo, pero que tenemos que fortalecer particularmente en estos casos.
Yes. And your follow-up question, thank you.
I have two quick questions, if you don't mind, sorry. And maybe I'm thick, I'm sorry. After today's announcement here at the United Nations, you go back to Canada, and what's the next step? What happens once you, domestically, with this implementation? Sorry.
Well, thank you. As you know, during the election, the platform was to implement the UN Declaration and all of the calls to action of our Truth and Reconciliation Commission, one of which was fully implementing the UN Declaration. I think what this allows is for us to proceed with a conversation with Canadians. But it also is a step in us pursuing a full reconciliation process that is based on the principles within the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People, breathing life into Section 35. I don't think most Canadians understand the Section 35 rights of Indigenous people in our country, and it's really important that that conversation be had in that putting treaty rights into that section was a hardly fought battle, and yet people don't. They somehow think it's only if possible, but those are rights. And I think it is about having a conversation with Canadians about Indigenous rights.
Sorry, so Section 35, for example, talks about seeking permission from Indigenous groups when it comes to land and resource development. The UN Declaration talks about obtaining, which is a very different word. And I'm just wondering how the Canadian government sees that difference, and whether maybe Section 35 will no longer say seek, and whether if you do implement, it will become obtain permission. Is that
There is no question that even whether it's in English and French is a little bit different. But the importance is that we understand that these are rights, and that being able to seek free, prior, informed consent, and be able to move forward in a way that everyone is together is the goal, and it is about us understanding that if you don't do that, and as my colleague said, if you wait till after the project is launched and started, that this won't be possible. So this is putting everyone on notice. You better get this done in terms of meaningful engagement, or else the project will founder.
I have one final request
last
from our
question,
Aboriginal
please.
unit in Canada. I'm so sorry. And Romeo Saganash has put forward a private member's bill twice now, again last month, calling for Canada to harmonize its own laws with UNDRIP. Could you just tell me where that private member's bill stands? Sorry, and that's it.
Sure. We talked a little bit about this at the parliamentary committee last week. It is private members' business is private members' business, and in our nation-to-nation approach and Inuit to Crown approach, it would be very important that we consult First Nations, Inuit, and Métis on anything that we would do about codifying the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. So it's very important that we understand and to begin that conversation with all Indigenous people as nation to nation, Inuit to Crown. And I don't think we can just go forward based on a private member's bill without appropriate consultation.
Yes, sir.
Thank you. My name is Abdul Hamid Sayan from the Arabic daily Al-Quds Al-Arabi. You keep, Madam Minister, you keep talking about reconciliation. The word reconciliation, as we understand it, it comes between, like after a conflict, after some kind of enmity, sometime war. That's the word reconciliation. So can you explain this? And is there any way, is there any reference in Article 35 in the Canadian Constitution that admits some kind of guilt to what happened to the Indigenous people, not by this generation, but in the past? Is there any kind of recognition that there is so much harm has been done to the Indigenous people? Thank you.
I don't think, as the Minister of Justice said this morning, until you admit the truth, there can't be any reconciliation. And so we know that the effects of colonization, residential schools, the Indian Act, there's just an unfortunate legacy that, as Justice Sinclair said, the secret of shame in our country. And so I don't think we're going to get to full reconciliation until every Canadian understands the harm that was done, and that only then can we come together in terms of a reconciliation. Because 250 years ago, at the Royal Proclamation, it was pretty clear that we were going to share this land fairly, and that we would work side by side in a real partnership of peace and friendship. And didn't happen. And so that's where I think the admission, and even in restorative justice, you have to admit that harm was done. And I think that's the journey we're on now in Canada. We are admitting that harm was done.
Thank you. Mr. Roy, Mr. Pop, any final words?
El tema de esta sesión del foro nos va a permitir escuchar a los pueblos indígenas sobre temas que hemos venido nacionalmente en todas las regiones viendo con mucha preocupación, pero también me parece que es un motivo verdaderamente significativo para confiar en que las posibilidades de tener una plataforma en Naciones Unidas, como es el foro permanente, puede permitirnos ir encontrando maneras de superar las crisis y los conflictos, pero también el cumplimiento de resoluciones. El tema de la administración de los recursos naturales está generando en el mundo grandes posibilidades de aumentar las crisis. Sin embargo, el tener una plataforma de esta naturaleza puede ayudar a superarlos. El tema del agua en muchas regiones del mundo ya es una fuente enorme de crisis y de conflicto. Pero me pregunto, ¿cómo le hablamos al oído de Wall Street para decirle que el tema de los derechos humanos y los derechos de los pueblos indígenas también son importantes más allá de la simple ganancia? El reto del cumplimiento de los derechos de los pueblos indígenas es enorme y la plataforma que el Foro Permanente está presentando y sigue presentando va a ser una oportunidad para enfrentarlo. Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much. Mr. Roy.
Thank you. Just a general remark that we really need to look at peace, as we mentioned earlier, with justice as a necessary part of it. You can have the cessation of hostilities, the body counts are less, but that doesn't mean that's real resolution. And these may recur again. So for the greater benefit of everybody, if we need stability and development for all, as like leaving no one behind, as the SDGs say, then we have to look at the roots of conflict, address it with justice. Modern-day agreements are also an example that Canada also shows to different parts of the world. But to have the agreements in order to implement them in good partnership.
Thank you very much. I'd like to thank our guests for coming and thank all of you for coming as well. Have a good afternoon. Thank you.